Hail and well met. My name's Max, this is Ethan.
And we are the LNGcast.
Today we'll be talking about modules versus homebrew. Alright, so we're going to be breaking up this podcast into sections. First section we call typical terms. The first thing you should talk about is the campaigns. The whole story covers multiple sessions. Sessions are each time the group meets up.
The other thing we want to talk about is modules versus homebrew. Modules are pre-written stories that come with everything all in one, whereas homebrews are something that the DM is creating as you go, building it as the players experience it.
So, talking about the mechanics of the actual RPGs, modules have pre-prepared dialogue.
Yep, that's going to... Which is kind of like a mixed bag overall, but it does definitely... But it can definitely be useful, especially for new-time DMs.
Yeah, it oftentimes allows for a easy theming of the game, as well as it allows you to move into the game a lot easier. But it also comes with a lot of downsides. For instance, it can really mess with flow. You're going through the game, and we've had it personally where there'll be a moment where we walk into the room, and a guy will walk up to you like a cutscene in a video game, and it really breaks the immersion. While at other times, you walk into the dungeon and the DM has this pre-prepared dialogue that says, you walk into the dungeon and you can see on the walls, bloody mist is seeping through the cracks. The floor is a damp green ooze and there are shackles hanging from the ceiling. It can set an atmosphere, and that really develops it as a good thing, but also, like we said,
It also can, frequently when it's breaking immersion, it can make it so that if you transition from the DMs doing their best, but frequently is not going to be up to the same par as what a professional writer can do over the course of months. So it can break the players of the immersion seeing the sudden shift. Though it also is kind of difficult for the DMs, because frequently, at least from my experience, and I'm pretty sure yours as well, it happens that as I start to read this, I am, as a DM, I'm mostly worried about presenting it, talking and enunciating everything, making it sound dramatic.
It's a change of mindset.
Yeah, but I'm actually not processing anything in my head. So then the players are okay, alright, sweet, I want to go over and investigate the chains. And then I, as the DM, have to say, wait, what chains? And go back and reread the entire thing just in order to figure out what they're talking about.
Exactly, and a lot of DMs can actually work with these pre-prepared dialogues, and they can rehearse them in such a way that it's natural. But as a new-time DM, these are great for learning the theme of this next encounter, this next area. The next thing we should probably bring up, speaking of encounters, is the preset stats of modules, which can be so great, especially in the case of loot tables, where it keeps the flow of gaming moving. For instance, when the wild magic sorcerer decides to roll on his magic table, you don't have to scramble through all your rules like, oh no, which magic table am I using for this campaign? Maybe that's a me problem. But with the loot tables, and these other tables that you have preset in the module, a lot of them will give you the theme of the magic that the wild magic sorcerer is, and also it allows you to keep the balanced loot.
Yeah, I think honestly this is probably going to be one of the bigger things that I really like about modules is the fact that I don't know, it's all there. It's all perfect. I feel like that's one of the main things that I have to spend most of my time as a DM working on is just building everything, just trying to figure out actually figure out, okay, what magic item is going to be in this chest? Okay, well, the players are going to walk down this corridor and turn to the left and see in this room what monsters will they see? Mm-hmm. And I think it's really nice that it's just really convenient that these things just exist. It takes a lot of the stress off more than anything.
And talking back about the stats and the DCs of all these kind of things, the players want to break down a door in a module. You know what the door is like. It's made of wood, and it has iron shackles. There are rules for that. There is the DC of this door, usually in the module.
Mm-hmm.
Now, oftentimes, that's the exact thing that modules are missing, is the fact that they don't have the DC for a certain lock pick, because they just didn't expect the players to pick the lock.
Yeah, that's fair. There's definitely some of the things that the people writing it, they can prepare for a lot, but they can't really do everything. But, I don't know. I think that, like, it's nice. I find that a lot of the time they cover most of the stuff, and then the DM just has to improv the rest of the things. Though honestly, I think that I like improving stuff anyway, even once it's already there.
Agreed. And modules don't stop you from improving in the moment. They also give you a spot where you're like, okay, I improved this. Now, what is the outcome supposed to be? I want to bring it back in there. Create the arc to return to it. And oftentimes the preset monsters, the monsters that are already there, that definitely helps you. And with all these stats for NPCs and all these other things, you're not sitting there with your random generator open, being like, okay, his name is Billy Bob Joe, and he's a human artificer.
Yep.
You have all these things, and it definitely helps you stay ahead of the players. And then the next thing, speaking of like having preset monsters or preset, the preset NPCs, you have I like to refer to it as predetermined encounters, or as my co-host might call it better suited, the balanced encounters.
Yeah. So a lot of times, take video games for example. The amount of times that people actually are behind the scenes making sure that this exact this situation is fun to go through and is actually, possible is enormous. People will play through a thing thousands of times. Whereas for a DM, you have no idea if, like, your homebrew fire troll is going to be able to, is going to be way more powerful than the party can deal with. Whereas with this one, because everything's already been set up, it is already guaranteed to have been balanced by usually people who are really good at the game, and it's also usually going to have been played through many times in order to make sure that it actually works.
Now, saying that the CR system is infallible. In fact, just running through it real fast, it's set up to be basically the number of the CR is the level of the average party of 4 people. If you have a group of 5, you're still only going to divide all those added up levels by 4.
Yeah.
So you could end up with an extremely powerful group, while the CR is going to wipe out all those low-level guys, while the one high-level guy, or the one munchkin, the one guy who has really increased his stats or his abilities really crazy high, is going to, either struggle or just decimate. So when we call it balanced, we're talking about balanced to the manufactured sense. And a lot of the time, those stats, like why I call them predetermined, is because we know that there's a story that comes afterwards. We know that there's more encounters, and we know that the characters will get this much XP by that point, which is also very helpful when doing both milestone and XP leveling.
Yeah, I think overall, I think that this is it's very useful, and I think that in general, it's always going to be better than just winging it as far as this goes. The fact that this thing has already been tested, as it were, it's going to mean that it's going to be more reliable.
Yes, reliable would definitely be the best word between predetermined and balanced. Reliable. Another thing about it is the fact that we already have pre-made dungeons. A lot of the work that is put into homebrewing is oftentimes making the dungeon and making sure that it's actually playable and enjoyable. Well, dungeons and modules are oftentimes set up to be a centerpiece. They're oftentimes, because you're going to be spending a lot of time in there, and while the DM can guess how much time you're going to be in there, modules oftentimes give you that pre-made estimate that is, typically pretty accurate. We've had a lot of games where the amount of time that we were in the dungeon varied greatly from the module, but running Adventure League games and playing in Adventure League games, they oftentimes stick to the module pretty handily, unless, of course, you end up with the min-maxing party, which, by the way, very fun. But these dungeons and these encounters with these monsters, they stay true to the module, and they make sense in that place. You're not having to come up with your own like random encounter tables, just like we mentioned earlier. As well as these dungeons, the amount of time that you're there, oftentimes is in correlation to how important the dungeon is.
Yeah. There's definitely. I think a lot of this, like what we're saying, is like very much like matches up with the like predetermined stuff. Like there's the whole thing on the encounter level of just like having everything balanced, but there's also just the fact that the entire story is somewhat like is really well paced. It means that the players are definitely going to feel like it's going. And one of the things I definitely want to mention as far as like the pre-made dungeons is just frequently they're just really pretty looking.
They are, and jumping straight off of that, the maps. One of the greatest things about modules is that you're coming to the game with a pre-made world. You're coming to the game with maps that have been used by players for, in some cases, decades.
Yeah.
And these maps are made by professional artists. DMs who want to make their maps look really pretty either have to be artists themselves, really good at certain software, or they have to fork over the cash to make these campaigns. Like, it honestly is, and the thing is, you are still giving up some cash to get these modules. That is one of the biggest downsides, I'd have to say to them.
Yes, definitely.
But the thing is, you are paying for what you get oftentimes with just the maps in the world alone.
Seriously, yeah. It might. Anyway, I had a completely different idea of like how you could like reuse other assets of like buy a module and then just ignore half the stuff in it and then just use the maps and dungeons.
I have straight up done that in the past. I have used no spoilers, is the beginning like second chapter of Lost Mines of Phandelver, where the cave that's in that module, I have used that dungeon so many times. Not let alone in Lost Mines of Phandelver, but also in many instances. It's a really good map that's been well made. And also, the tactical maps released by D&D oftentimes make really good maps for other situations. And getting away from D&D for just a second, other maps and modules are extremely helpful. You run a Traveler game, you don't have to build that entire galaxy when you already have the Segmentum vector. Like, you already have the Milky Way in there. You already have all these, the Alfarius, I want to say is one of them. You already have all of these maps in the game that you're playing. And now you don't have to build your own solar systems. You don't have to build your own galaxy. That is part of the fun a lot of the time, but at the same time as now you know the exact distances from Tormach to, what was the planet that we went to? Do you remember?
Oh, it's been so long. I don't think so.
Marduk.
Marduk, right?
Marduk.
That sounds familiar. Yeah.
So you already know the distances between Tornok 5 and Marduk. You already know the distances between those things, and other people can tell you what exactly that is. And that leads us straight into our next thing, the public access.
Yeah, I think this is honestly possibly one of my... It could be my favorite. I said before about how I really like the pre-made DCs. This one might be the biggest reason, in my opinion, to use modules ever.
Because when you look at a homebrew campaign, you can talk to other people about it, but you can't get your players' feedback off of a homebrew campaign. Because, you want to keep your secrets. You want to make sure that the game is playable and they're learning as they go. Well, with a module, there is an entire internet that you can jump off of, and you don't have to just get noticed in a Reddit thread or on the local Facebook or any of those kind of things. Like, you don't have to get noticed in order for these things to get heard. So in the public, when we talk about like the Internet of Things and how you can look back and talk to all these people about this specific module. For instance, I've had many conversations about Curse of Strahd, and we'll give that thing its own video, because it deserves one. But Lost Mines of Phandelver, watch the Adventure Zone, watch all these other places, and they use these crazy good modules, and even some of the bad modules. And that's another thing. There's reviews out on these modules.
Yeah. Some of these things, like, it's really funny. The Lost Mines of Phandelver in particular, the one that you've like brought up so many times. I have seen it run so many times by other people, by like just joining in his games, by joining in other people's games. There is just I've seen that same module so many times, but the funny thing about it is that they all play out slightly differently. And it's my favorite thing is just comparing and saying like, we're doing about it an entirely different way. We did this instead.
And we've even done it different ways each time. We have broken that module so many times. We've played it with different leveled characters. We've played it with specific characters. I really recommend this module for both new players and old. It definitely reminds me of like fresh D&D. And another thing to that is that as the public access to this is that's the main thing. You can talk to people about one, how the DMs ran this, but also you can talk to players. You can be like, hey, in this circumstance, was this combat too difficult? We don't want to get into the narrative just yet because we still have to talk about homebrew and its mechanical issues. But at the same time, as we do want to talk about how we do need to mention that on a storytelling level, the public access allows you to change it. It allows you to know which parts to change. It allows you to redefine how you let a point like show. For instance, if it's a troll in your games and your players have never come up with a troll, this might be a spoiler for some people, but it's a folklore thing, so I feel like I can say it. Trolls are weak to fire. Now, if you make some way of showing that in the module, oftentimes that is the only way to defeat one because of the regeneration ability. But the thing is, in that sense, the module will oftentimes like give you an example. It'll give you options. When you fight a troll in a dungeon, there's oftentimes torches or barrels of oil in the module. And that's something that we oftentimes forget as DMs to put in there with these homebrew adventures. But because of the public access, other DMs can be like, well, I'd recommend putting in a fire source. Some way to recharge your fire abilities to inflict damage to this troll.
Yeah. Like, I remember that when we were playing the aforementioned Curse of Strahd, I found, like, another group of people who were playing it online, and I kind of, like, just to kind of, like, see how they did it. I didn't actually end up stealing all that much, but it was just really good to get, like, a sense of how this could be run. And then I could then make my own decisions based off that.
Exactly. And we could keep on going on and on about this specific topic. This is definitely the biggest call to action when it comes to modules. One module that gets a lot of flack are the Tyranny of Dragon books.
Ugh.
It is a that sigh of like discomfort for my co-host here, which just says it all. It is they are mass produced. They are made to fit the mold, and the thing is, the public has definitely said that, but they've also mentioned ways to get around that. So. Jumping over to the attributes of, like, homebrew adventures.
Yeah. So, I think that there's a whole lot to say, because I think that while I do, like, I like them both, I think that homebrew is my personal favorite of these two.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that most people who play will oftentimes play a homebrew campaign, even in their very first time. And DMs oftentimes feel a sense of, like, almost a need to be homebrewers. We need to really build our own worlds. And jumping back to, like, our definitions earlier, homebrew really does come from the terms homemade and then brewing. Kind of, like, building.
Yeah. I think that there's, like, a lot of, like, just talking about, like, the different, like, expectations, I think that there's a lot of I think it's interesting, because there's, whereas, with, like, the modules, if you know Curse of Strahd, it literally says on the back of the cover that this is a book about vampire hunting, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas with, like, homebrew, things can be, like, very, very complicated. Like, how many, like, stories have you seen where they, like, start off with, like, one thing and then it completely pivots to do something else? And that
I've had my own games just like that, and from personal experience, we've had games where it started out with dungeon crawls and meat grinder campaigns, and then turned into straight up funhouse open world games where let alone the story, the mechanics even changed. In our personal game that's being ran by my Ethan here, we had it started out with basically a castle builder game where we are now dealing with intercontinental politics, and I'm trying to convince my players to commit war crimes. Yep. Like it can change on a dime.
Yeah. Which I think is like it. I think that there's like something like I think that there's the players will expect as soon as you introduce something in one way, they'll kind of expect things to stay a little bit. Like there has been times when, like I know, like as a player's experience, sometimes these shifts are like they can be seen as negative. Sometimes that when you're used to like something else and you really like how this one thing was going, and then suddenly it shifts to be something super different, that can be a negative. But at the same time, I think that there's a little bit of the zaniness. I feel like that a lot of like homebrew worlds get a lot of personality, and that's really great on that front.
Agreed. And it's a flex as a DM to hear your say that your world is good. Not to mention, you now are the amount of work that you have to put into this campaign is oftentimes astronomical, and in some cases, it's literally astronomical in the fact that you are building entire worlds, and from the ground up. Oftentimes, it's a creative flex in a way to say, "I made this monster," and you really have to understand the system to start really homebrewing. You can start homebrewing to learn the system. But when you actually know the system and you homebrew, speaking just from speaking just as seeing other people homebrew and seeing myself, I can see my homebrew and go, I love this. It has a lot of personality to it, and it narratively makes sense. But oftentimes, when I do the math after, like when we do the math at first, we're like, oh yeah, this will work great. That has its own issues right there.
But when you get it just right. When you get it to work,
sense in this world works, and those are the moments that you remember when you're playing. And like looking at other DMs, Matt Mercer comes to mind, my opinion, but still he homebrewed it at first, and he created this entire world.
There's definitely it's a really great feeling once you like can see like creators are interacting with the world and they start treating it as real. As soon as they start to see, oh wow, these two things connected. Oh wow, that thing right there, that's neat right there.
Yeah, and you actually get, and now you're creating your own monsters. Now you're creating your own classes. And at that point you're really feeling like you own the game, and that's a good feeling. There's also, that's like leaning back on that. Another great thing about Homebrew Adventures is that your house rules are supported. If you want to make sure that criticals feel like criticals, or if you want to use this new thing that you heard online, you can. And there's nothing saying that it won't be unbalanced. If you try to use other homebrew rules in a module, it can vastly overpower the module.
Yeah, or underpower in the case of some things.
Mm-hmm. It can definitely underpower the module, making the module super easy, or making the module feel extremely difficult. I know personally, using Milestone, and which is a type of leveling, using that and using it slower than the game expects you to, it can make the players think extremely tactically, but it also can make every encounter feel like a death sentence.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. I think that there's I think I'm kind of maybe taking this the logical extreme for the example, which is kind of my homebrew leveling system, which we'll probably go into more detail later.
There will be an entire episode dedicated to that alone.
But simply put, the quick details about it are that it keeps everyone really low level, but offers a lot of customization. The important thing, though, is that if you were trying to do this in a module, the players would be ripped to shreds right now.
Oh yeah, we are playing at what was the level that what was the CR of our last encounter?
Oh, I think
not the diplomatic encounter, because I already know the CR of that was insane. We're not talking about that.
No, not that one. They were going through a dungeon that I had built for players about 6th to 7th level.
Mm-hmm.
Though this was intentional, I did want to challenge them a lot because they were effectively 4.5 level.
Yeah,
4.5 level.
we're essentially 4.5 level. Again, the custom leveling system is very convoluted. But we were getting nearly TPK'd, total party kill. All of our players nearly died every single session more than once.
Yeah, but the thing is that I had full control over how hard everything was. It wasn't perfect control, like going back to like the balanced encounters. I wasn't 100% sure about anything. But I know that if I was going to introduce it to an adventure that expected you to be first level at this point, 5th level at this point, and 9th level at this point, when they were playing at essentially 4.5 level for basically ever, that there's going to be some serious problems.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And that is definitely something that is also great about homebrew, is that you do have that complete control. You see that the players are struggling at a 6th level encounter, you can say, okay, all encounters from now on are going to be 6th level, rather than us bumping it up to 7 until you guys can handle a 6th level encounter.
It does just take a lot of work in order to get things, to actually like pay attention in order to like actually crunch the numbers, figure out, okay, what are the chances that are they going to survive this? If I put this right here, are they suddenly going to walk from this encounter into here? Things can get nuts, the amount of work that you have to do in order to keep things balanced.
Yes, and that's not to say that the mechanics alone are stopping anybody from playing, from DMing a homebrew adventure. In fact, oftentimes, DMing a homebrew adventure is a great way to learn the rules. And lastly, before we jump into our next section, I want to bring up just the access to information that your players have to deal with. Personally, I personally believe that you should always build your campaigns after the players have told you what they're playing. For instance, if one person wants to play a Tabaxi and the other person wants to play a Triton, you now have to make a world that has both Tabaxis and Tritons. So if you want to play in Camelot, you're going to have a bit of an issue when a cat person walks into the court of King Arthur.
Yeah. I think that has kind of like been a trend I've seen. I'm not sure if this is like almost certainly not going to be the rule, but a lot of homebrews I've seen have very particular ideas when it comes to races, whereas most modules are pretty like open-ended.
Agreed. Yes, modules are designed for the system and the world that they were already made in, and typically that entire world, that system supports. In Dungeons and Dragons, that the world of the Forgotten Realms, it even has Warforged in it now. They have an explanation for all of these races because they were built for that game.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, a game like Traveller or Call of Cthulhu, where race has in Traveller, race does have a rather big point, but the thing is, the rules support it as well. There is a reason why your dog person and your lion person and your 3 humans are all on a jet together, while and it's a smaller scope, so it's an easier time to do it. Well, with something like Call of Cthulhu, where the race doesn't matter, you do not have a race in that game. Now, that is to say that you might have a race and a background. Now you have to deal with the backgrounds. In D&D specifically, with all these races and all these other things, in homebrew, it does typically seem to be very specific, and that's because you can focus in on the players. With a module, it is kind of cut and paste in there.
There's something really cool, like, if you're working with your DM, as far as, like... So the big thing is just figuring out how the players and the DM are going to understand the weird intricacies of this world. If you do it well, then you can have something like our friend here, like, one of our friends is playing a Shard Mind, which is something that, like, is actually from an older version of D&D, but is no longer in this version, so... He's pretty much the only Shard Mind in the world, as far as I'm aware. He is a unique creature.
And in my case, I'm playing a Leonin. But this campaign came from Eberron and is now in Avernus. So, and there is rules to explain how Eberron and Avernus are connected in the book, Descent into Avernus, because in every single game they do try to explain this away. They oftentimes, in all of the books I've read for Dungeons and Dragons, at least the official books, they say you can find this. Maybe it's in a secret temple that has an interplanar web, Or and oftentimes with Greyhawk, as Greyhawk was the predecessor to Forgotten Realms, they oftentimes have places that could be easily explained away by just saying, "Oh, it's not on this hill; it's on this hill," or "It's not in Baldur's Gate; it's in the other town I can't remember." Either way, they do have explanations for all these in the official games. I don't know if our DM did that because I came in a little bit late for that one.
No, I'm pretty sure that, like, I think that he justified it, but I think that it was, like, I don't think...
It was a little bit more
created that.
Wavy.
Yeah, he specifically found a way, like, he was working on trying to find a way to, like, pair this player's, in this case, your specific situation to make sense in this world.
Yes, and I'm not the Shardmine. I'm actually playing Leonin. And he's kind of let me just go ahead and write however I want to be there. And for my character, it just makes sense. And for your characters, you're just like, well, the Shardmine's here. Everything's normal.
Yeah. The key is really just to, like, try to get it to work. There's been times when someone tries to play someone like an ancient Egyptian in a game that just does not line up with anything, which...
We speak from experience.
Yes.
And so like that information access is definitely a roadblock in the way of homebrew, but also it's a really good thing. For instance, in a Forgotten Realms based module, where we'll take Temple of Elemental Evil, you can straight up go home and Google it. You can Google the like, who is this character? Who is this? Who is this? Who is this? What is this? What is the history of this mountain? Like, that can actually be a really good bonus, but also sometimes when you have that player who's like, oh, I know what this is, I know what this is, I know what this is.
Yeah.
And I've been that player before, especially when we started playing D&D, because I had been the forever DM until I passed the torch over to Ethan here.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. It's although give it back, I want to DM again. It was definitely something that was really interesting because I knew a lot about the worlds. I did a ton of homework. I loved looking into the lore, and we'll definitely be talking about lore on another episode.
Yeah.
And it'll definitely be a long discussion. But we have all of these like, you have all this information that's out there, and it's give or take what your players know.
Yeah.
And with a public game like a module, you can just straight up Google it. While in a homebrew,
yep. If you're in a homebrew world, then nothing exists. Module, you can look it up, and that means both spoilers, but then also like can be like perfectly well integrated into a massive, like, taking all the work from dozens of people, or not even dozens, like thousands of people who've been contributing to this hobby. Whereas homebrew, sometimes, like, you don't get access to that wealth of knowledge, but at the same time, you get some mysteries.
Definitely the mystery. I've seen a lot of people play horror or mystery games that rely on the fact that the players don't know. And one of my favorite Call of Cthulhu campaigns that I didn't get to play, and I was listening to it, was definitely one where none of the players had ever played it before, and the wealth of knowledge that this DM was able to create in this world was amazing. One I really want to bring back, up again, is the Adventure Zone, where Griffin McElroy did such an amazing job with the world building right there, and his players moved along with it. Now, true, these are professionals, and these guys were amazing. They were at the very forefront of 5th edition, but at the same time as he built his world, and he did amazing. The players had to figure it out along the way. A lot of the mystery in this world, let's say one of the characters had his story in the online beforehand, and one of the players may have accidentally heard it or even Googled it in some sort of sense. That would have completely just nuked that story, that mystery, because that player would know. Now, it is that player's responsibility to play along and role play.
But sometimes it's like leveraging information that is so hard to avoid that you can't do anything. Mm-hmm. Like in our current game, it's not a huge deal, but Tiamat is something that our characters do not know about, but every one of the players does.
And even myself personally, I know all about Zariel. I love her character arc and all of the stuff that happened to her. And I accidentally brought up the Blood War in our last campaign, and our DM was like, I changed the timeline. It literally changed the game for me as a player, because because he realized that since I knew that information, he was going to have to change something here and there.
Yeah. So I think that, I don't know, I think that's a lot of what we have to say.
Alright, welcome back. This next section is called The Rambling Mound. No structures, sort of us talking about our experience with D&D and other RPGs. And my co-host here has something to say about that.
Yeah. So, still regarding like the topic of homebrew versus modules, I think that this might just be me, or it could just be maybe it's more of a universal experience. But I think that the swapping between them was hugely informative. Specifically, I started homebrew. I think that a lot of people think that homebrew is better. We'll talk about more about that in a little bit. But I started off with homebrew, and it was crap. There was everything was like super disorganized. I didn't know how to like structure anything, and there were, even if like we're being like extremely generous, there were some things that were pretty bad. However, then later I ran the now somewhat famous in our group Chris Strahd game, and that game, because it was so much, I didn't have to worry about creating it. Things just worked. I can instead work on making it better, making it, adding my own flair, adding the stories that I liked into a game that already existed. And because of that confidence, seeing that the players respond to that, as well as just in general seeing how a professional would structure a story, I think it seriously helped me with my further games after the fact.
Yeah, and granted that you did kind of jump in on my previous game, one of your first homebrew games, and I know you started doing other homebrew before and after that, and so I can't just speak that I handed you destroyed and shredded reins, although I did. We also had the fact that, in my personal experience, I started with homebrew as well. I feel like in most cases, DMs will start with the homebrew. However, they'll most likely hear D&D from Module. In, again, my personal experience, I heard of D&D through friends, and also I was really pushed to start playing after listening to Taz, the Adventure Zone. And the very first time as a player I enjoyed it was through a module, the infamous Tyranny of Dragons module, where I played an extremely broken character, which... Let's just say broken characters are sometimes the best. I'm currently playing a broken character in one of our friends' campaigns, and he is beautiful, over 116 damage at level 9, and it just feels good. Like, that's so low damage too, and I love it. There's a lot to homebrewing and stuff, and as a new DM, it oftentimes is what you jump into. Because either you haven't done a lot of research into the worlds that there are, and also that it grants you this certain safety that because it is your world.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of DMs. I feel like that they start off, they have like some idea, people like how many people do you know that like want to be an author, that want to write stories or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of work, and importantly, it takes a lot of like bad attempts before you get good.
Absolutely. I had the weirdest time. For instance, my first campaign that I actually ran was the second campaign I was in, and it was I actually consider it my first time playing D&D, because it was the biggest. Like, it was the one that we actually almost finished. And it was something I sunk all of my time into during high school. And it was great, and I played with people I knew. And it definitely messed up my expectations, because I thought I was a good DM. And then once I started playing with people who I knew less and less and less, until the point I was playing with strangers, I found out that I was not a good DM. And then I started playing modules. And these modules really did point the interests. They made me figure out what my campaigns are.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, a very painfully specific example is the first, like, when I took over the reins of the campaign that he started, at that point, the big bad evil guy, the main villain of the story, hadn't been introduced yet. And so I created my own. And he was the worst. Not, like, in a good way that you love to hate him. I don't even remember his name. I can't even tell it to you.
I can't remember his name, or all I know is he wanted to, like, end the world to bring his family back or something like that.
I think I honestly don't even remember, because the thing was that he was so bad that after, like, the first encounter, I pretty much like, after I introduced him and the introduction went so poorly, I tried to abandon it. Like, at first I couldn't, just because of story reasons that were set up. But, like, as soon as I could, the players basically stole his power source and then got to the climax of that campaign without him.
Yeah, and then when he actually changed, when he changed entirely, he became a new character, and he was, it was just, yeah, his motivations and his character completely changed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the nice thing then was that you got to see someone, like, because I had no idea how to run a big bad evil guy, the thing I was, like, the best example, the best worst example, is his introduction. Like, I think that he was supposed to be, like, he was going to come and, like, kill the world tree or something like that.
Part of the best part of his character was when he came in and we found out that he was the source of the problem. And we actually had a lot of fun in that game specifically, like that session specifically, because we got to have a battlefield in an elf town. Like, that was great.
But that was the session before the introduction. That wasn't the introduction itself.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Because the introduction itself was awful. Basically, I just said, oh yeah, he has, like, so much AC you can't hit him. He also does not care about you in the slightest. He's only here to kill the world tree. He could decimate you in a second because he's, like, 10 times your level.
Didn't we also, like, try to use magic missile and you were just like, magic ward?
Basically. Something like that. It was bad.
Yeah, and I've definitely been guilty of that before, plot armoring certain players, or even, like, well, like, my worst case was I plot armored a player, and then, I've also plot armored, like, monsters and stuff. Now, I am guilty of the cardinal sin of DMing, where you just do everything on the fly, where you don't have your stats, you don't have your character stats, and you don't have, like, you literally have a blank page that you're writing down everything. And I don't keep notes, which is definitely, that's like a sin in DMing.
To be fair, you can pull it off a little bit better than a lot of other people. Your style relies on improv a lot more than mine.
Yeah. And that's another thing that I learned by running my modules and running games is I actually have a very hard time sticking with reading something because of how my brain works. And so I oftentimes just have to take the bare minimum notes of each module, and I don't want to stop the flow of the game, so I just jump to those notes. So a lot of the times I've ran modules, even in the two or three times I've ran League, I ran them by bullet points.
Mm-hmm. Whereas, like, for me, I think that, like, I read the Curse of Strahd book so many times. There was so much stuff. I, like, went through every single detail, every single thing, because this was the game that became famous, and I'm glad it became famous in our group, because this was, like, the big shifting point, and I think that, like, notes, that's kind of when I learned that, like, that over-preparing works really well for me.
And that's another thing. With homebrew campaigns and with modules, you really get to learn, and specifically with modules, you really get to learn where your strong suits are, because the module makes up for your weak point. You can't always rely on modules, because at some point you're going to play them all, and at that point, now you can play all the official ones.
Yeah.
And then from that point, now you should probably know what you're doing. And some people are just better at running modules than other people. I know I can't run a single module for very long before it turns into something completely different. And I have read I have read Tales of the Yawning Portal at least 100 times, and I cannot tell you what's in each individual story other than maybe the basic premise.
Yeah.
But some people could probably tell me it all the way through. They could tell me exactly what encounters happen where. We should probably get on to the narrative now.
Yep, seems like a pretty good idea. So yeah.
Alright, and for our last section of the podcast, we want to quickly mention narrative. As far as narratively speaking goes, modules have a lot of things going for them, and a lot of things that stop them from being, playable.
Yeah, so talking about, just starting off is the linearity issue.
And to define that, it's really like you're on, it's kind of choose your own adventure book oftentimes, where talking with other people, you can definitely talk about how, okay, we did this in this campaign, and you're going to hear that someone else did the same thing oftentimes. Or it's going to be, in a lot of cases, how did we get here?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times the, one of the biggest issues, I've talked about the, my favorite things about modules. Probably one of my least favorite things is the feeling of just kind of the constrainedness of it all. Yes, you absolutely could derail the entire thing, but the module is built for you to do this.
And to say that you can derail it is exactly the point of saying that it's linear. It is already on rails. You're already headed to your destination. A train doesn't make turns. It goes from A to B, and it's on the tracks the whole time. And that can be the same case in a module. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. Oftentimes, in fact, in all of our games, a lot of people have made a lot of choices, and the module has been there to accept those choices. But at the same time, as we still went from, in Curse of Strahd, and this should not be a spoiler to anybody, we still went from showing up in Barovia to killing Strahd.
Yeah.
There was a lot that happened in between, but everything that happened in between was more of how well the story was written and how well Ethan ran it to the credit. While with a game more like Tyranny of Dragons or Elemental Evil, you're really constrained to, you go from point A to point B to point C. And anything in between is either downtime where things are actually interesting, or it's just, how did we get from here to here?
Mm-hmm. It very much does vary module by module. Some of them are pretty open, and they're, even at their most open, they're going to be more constrained than Homebrew, but they're at least fine. But then there are the Tyranny of Dragons.
And we can talk about that another time, but it is definitely one of those games where it feels like a choose-your-own-adventure book. And at times, there are straight-up scene skips.
Yeah. That's the whole thing, is just the level of... So just talking about that, even then, talking about some of the... Sorry.
Quality?
Yeah. Just talking about how the quality and how that works, they're pretty okay. Most of them, most modules will be functional. That's oftentimes what we've been saying.
They hit a bar, and oftentimes they hang by that bar, and they just, they hang by it. And in a lot of third-party modules, that is actually the case. They grab onto that bar, and they claim that they have everything. They have the balance of a module sometimes. They have the, attributes of, we go here, we go here, we go here. But then official campaigns, it's either above the bar or below the bar. And when they go below the bar, it's oftentimes jarring. It oftentimes takes away from the feeling.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels less like that they're creating an actual world, and sometimes feels like, oh, this is a writer whose its job to produce a story, and they need to pad for time, therefore they'll add in this thing. Not actually because it's good, but because it had to be made.
Yeah, and oftentimes that gives the game either feeling very video gamey or very booky. And and that's something that you really want to stay away from. It's the balance in between those that really gives D&D its feeling, or any RPG its feeling. One game in Call of Cthulhu that I've played in was a mystery where we had to find something. And one of the biggest problems with that module was that if you did not find the specific key in your neighbor's basement, you could not progress. And the thing is, the module gave no explanation on how to go back and get that key once you went to the old lady's house.
Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. Definitely there's the structured nature that I feel like that. Whereas a homebrew game, in that kind of situation, the DM could have just found, maybe there was the front door, or like, the important key, there's this door that you need to get into. But there's also a back door,
Or even you could just be like, because the players don't have any expectation of what we said, or there wasn't a reason for that mystery to be there anymore because you made it, you can completely rewrite that without, like, fear of the story changing too much, or from it feeling derailed, because in your game, you can now justify that later on. While in a module, it gives you a lot less room to justify that because of the constraints. But also the great part about that is if you do forget something, like in modules, if you forget something, you have other people to ask about it. You can be like, hey, my players forgot to go to Old Man McGuckin's house and ask about the key. And if they did, someone else goes, oh, I just had them go right down the street, or Old Man McGuckin is the janitor, and so he was dropping by the house to make sure that my DM kind of just explained to us that we forgot the key and had an NPC drop it by, which really broke the immersion.
Yeah, it definitely,
yeah. And other times, another great thing about narrative when it comes to modules is the fact that they're pre-written and other people can help you. And even though you don't know the system, it's a great way to learn the system.
Yeah, it's a pretty... And was about this. It's a great idea to be able to, if you're taking it, like, because there's a certain bar in your system, it very much is it's reliably okay. Sometimes it'll be pretty bad, but it'll be alright. At least
in a homebrew, you are going to have to learn the system. You should already know the system at least a bit when you're making homebrew, because you need to know what monsters can your players actually encounter. I personally speak from experience when I have definitely tried to TPK my party a couple of times, and either not been able to do it or completely overdid it. But at the same time, as I enjoy a narrative game and a cinematic game, and so my players did not get TPK'd by the monsters I gave them because I could control the outcome. I could control where it was coming from. While in a module, if I had those monsters and my players were like, why didn't he use his multi-attack, or all these other things, it can kind of take away from the immersion.
Right, exactly. And I think, so, a slight transition, but also keeping it going on. One of, like, the big tools with everything actually fits together.
Definitely agree with that. There's a lot of moments in a homebrew campaign where a zany action will happen, and by zany we mean silly or just out there. A moment where a player will do something that would not make sense in any world, let alone your world. You're playing in an Arthurian legend, and a little rock gnome, or even just like some strange dwarf-looking dude, gray dwarf, Duergar, which that name straight sounds not an Arthurian legend, shows up in the court of Arthur, and everyone's just like, kill the magic beast. Or another circumstance is, well, a dwarf shows up in a high elf's court. Both of these situations can have their weirdness to them. And furthermore, you would have a urban fantasy, and your players are trying to play, in this system, like, your players are trying to play this weird character. In homebrew campaigns, that can happen a whole lot more, because the homebrew campaign is your baby. It's something that you have made yourself. While in a module, there's a lot more planning that has taken place beforehand to make sure that these are, welcoming. And in the case that they're not, well, then that's the module's fault.
Yeah, exactly. It just sort of, because, kind of getting back to the same thing, it's reliable in a way that, homebrew games aren't. The fact that it's a lot easier to stay on theme when everything was built from the ground up with a specific idea in mind.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And building it from the ground up is something that we should probably bring up. Is also, what about the cultural aspect of building it from the ground up? In a module, there is no building it from the ground up, but now you have to convince people to play it, and so there can sometimes be a certain treatment of how you how you introduce it.
Yeah, I think that there's been some times it swings both ways, but whenever you hear your DM saying, "Hey, I want to run this module, Curse of Strahd, Dragon Heist, whatever,
Tomb of Horrors."
Oh yeah,
certain modules make you feel a certain way. When you hear that your DM is ready to play Curse of Strahd, you're like, "Ooh, I gotta find out what it feels like to fight a world-class vampire." When your DM says, "Hey, I want to play Tomb of Horrors," you go, "Oh no, my character is going to die," or you go, "Oh, this will be so interesting. I get to be tactical about this."
Yeah. There's definitely a lot to be said about that. Though also, I think it does swing both ways. If you do hear that, this module is terrible, even if your DM is good, the fact that you already have this pre-bias against it can work against you.
Absolutely. For instance, whenever someone hears that you're going to play Dragon Heist, there are some parts of that module where a lot of people have talked about it, where it's like, "Ooh, that's going to be a tough one," or where the introduction is oftentimes really rough. Well, a game like Tyranny of Dragons, when you hear that, everyone in the room who knows about it just goes, "Ooh, that's going to be a tough one."
Yeah, exactly. I think there's also something to say about just the very idea of module versus homebrew, and just kind of a player's initial reaction to it.
Definitely, and also during the game, if your DM can't make up for the fact that the adventure isn't very good, or if they keep running the module straight out of the book, it breaks the immersion more than if they were to give a bad homebrew.
Exactly. It feels frequently, I think that there's a lot of times when just especially when it is a transition from a homebrew world into just a certain level of freedom, all of the previous things can suddenly build up. There's suddenly that you go, "Oh crap." So
I agree, and oftentimes it feels like there's less freedom. And lastly, there's definitely that idea where players game, and then they'll also feel like, "Oh, I'm being forced into the system." Like we said with linearity, rules have a rap about being, choose your own adventure books,
which is kind of,
it's undeserved, but at the same time, are very much deserving of those titles.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's sometimes where there's definitely something to say. There's the one that's kind of the one that builds the bad name. The thing that we really are maybe going a little bit too far on with the Tyranny of Dragons. There's plenty of other ones like Prince of the Apocalypse are also pretty bad.
Absolutely, yeah. And Curse of Strahd, Call of Cthulhu, Ghost in the Attic. That one is a very much choose your own adventure one. You don't do much. It's called that one in Traveler, very much choose your own adventure town, and do whatever they are expecting you to do. You cannot progress with the story.
Yeah. It's fine to have a starting point, or even having some sort of intended thing in both homebrew or in modules or whatever. But there's definitely the linearity can be a problem, and more than anything, it's a problem that sticks in players' heads for a long time.
Definitely, and homebrew can have that same stigma. when you start talking about, hey, I want to run a homebrew, the players now have, oh no, I don't know what's going to go on, and sometimes they go, well, do you think you're really ready to run a homebrew?
Yep, yeah. And then also the other, kind of like the other side, sometimes the DM is a little too ready and too excited.
And I've definitely experienced that. I've definitely been the too ready, too excited DM. And when that does happen, you end up either oversharing, undersharing, or just forcing your players into a role they never wanted to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. I think if there's like a number of times whenever someone's like, oh, hey, look about this thing in my world, I'm internally rolling my eyes a little bit like, all right, sure. Fine. I guess I'll listen to this.
Which I feel called out.
Not so much for you. I mean, I shouldn't say anything specific, but there's been I have some bad examples. You get excited about things, but you are not the worst offender in this regard.
But I've definitely been that DM, and I have definitely been a player in games like that. I had one DM who had built an amazing pantheon, I'll be honest. It was great and well thought out. But the world? No. That world was absolutely terrible, and it was very constraining. He had a lot of DMPCs, which, by the way, is a Dungeon Master character, which plot armored all over the place. It was
yeah.
I've seen some pretty bad things in that regard, and that's something that I will never forget about that DM, is that I cannot place homebrew campaigns, because they always end up that way.
Yeah, DMPCs are definitely going to be a subject for another future topic.
Absolutely, yes. And there are definitely ways where you can play them amazingly, and they can be super helpful. I feel like a couple of the characters in your campaign right now are DMPCs, and they are great. I would not want them out of the campaign at all. And in my very first campaign, I had a character who one of the players actually romanced, and he was a DMPC at first, and he was great. I got rid of him when he was starting to become too relevant, but at the same time, as he was a good character.
But anyway, that's a sidetrack.
That's now jumping over to the attributes of homebrew. We have a lot, purely talking about homebrew here. One of the main gripes a lot of people will say, and one of the best ways that homebrew mitigates the linear or the pre-built world issue is, and I believe it was Coville who said this, it was to build your world around the players.
Yes, this can be a big deal. Especially when there's certain stuff, if you already have, a huge, all these preconceptions for every single different race, to some degree that can be a little helpful, but at the same time it can be very constraining. If the players want to play a goblin, but goblins are kill on sight every single time, that's going to be hard. And while that is, somewhat standard, that it's important to be able to communicate about what the heck what the player wants, and how to make sure that happens in this world.
Perfect example. A game I once played, I tried to play a low magic world, which we'll bring that up later as well. It was a world where magical creatures were going extinct, and things like that were just abnormal, and certain countries were actually anti-magic. And almost all of my players were magical creatures. One of the biggest players was a tiefling, and in my world they were druidic. It was great. They were fae, and then we only had one human in that party, which is something we should bring up, but on another later episode. Menageries. Anyways, basically, it was a very highly problematic game, and our half elf decided to get our gnome in trouble. And the gnome player has never played since.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate that, if you can build it so that the players are comfortable and they, understand the world, that, especially if you can do stuff a great example, what we were talking about before with, the Shard Mind, again. This player had I don't know how specific an idea he had at the beginning, but I think that he's standing the fact. You know what? This isn't actually so much the part of my character I want to focus on. I want to just be like, maybe there's like a small colony that people have heard of. And I'm not that weird, but well, then the DM could have like worked with him. But because he chose to be this weird person, that's when he decided. Well, that's hugely affected how like his character interacts. Like almost every NPC back before like the current like module that we're in, back before they descended into Avernus, every single time we walked into town, every time we met an NPC, they're like, "Oh, you are, you're a shark
made of rocks."
Yeah, you're made of rocks. You're made of extremely valuable gems.
Mm-hmm.
That is fascinating.
Absolutely. And my character, being from another world himself, and not seeing it as a problem either, which is definitely something I love playing out. Talking to this other character who is, again, not from this world is is definitely something that offers a little bit of banter. I ask him about his origin, he can't tell me. And he asks me about my origin, and I can tell him, but it makes no sense to him.
That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
It has been a lot of fun to run off that. But then in your campaign, we have a character in there who he doesn't have a backstory. And so anytime we try and play off of him, nothing happens.
Yeah. I think that there's definitely a lot to do with trying to, if you can get your players like invested in the stuff, and I've tried with him, he seems that, not for a lack of trying, but for all the other players, I'm trying to get them to make sense and that the players can care about, which is something.
Exactly, and that's something that you can really do. You have those hooks. You can change your world to give us hooks.
Exactly. And to a degree, you can kind of do that with pre-written modules, but it's very much on the module's terms. You can say, oh, hey, the Harpers, that group of, like, Forgotten Realms people who want, like, super altruistic, that you can have connections with them, but the players, frequently, that's the players saying, hey, I want to interact with your world, which is not always super common.
Yeah, and in a module, it's oftentimes on the players to say, like, to come up with why they matter in that world. And while in a homebrew campaign, if you build the campaign, then they already have hooks because their backstory. One of the characters was a worshiper of Osiris. She didn't care about any of the other Egyptian gods. All she cared about was Osiris. Later, it came into play that she cared a little bit about Anubis. But being the fact that I love mythology, I was able to run off of that and be like, okay, we can say that in this world, Osiris is the one god of death, or that he's one of many gods of death, and we can run off of that. We also made it so that other characters who were elementals, I had a water genasi and a fire genasi who wanted. Well, actually, it was air, which. At first in my mind is that's a terrible idea. Yeah. And then I put more thought into it, and I'm like, actually, this is a really good idea. This blends well with the world I want to build. And so then we started building the world around that, and I started making the planes based off of that idea. And I've learned from that experience specifically that characters love it when you know about their backstory and you build the world around them, and they feel like they belong to that world.
Right. Also, potentially at the risk of invoking the Mercer effect, Critical Role is literally built on the characters' backstories.
Absolutely. Nott's backstory has a huge effect on the campaign, with the world and its political dynamics.
Exactly.
I mean, Travis is a great player, and his backstory, as far as I could tell, initially had its own world, and it was much more large scale. But then you also have the other characters and how their backstories really fleshed out in this world.
Oh yeah, so much.
And that's only the new campaign. The old campaign absolutely built off of the characters. It was literally designed around houses were developed for Percy and also Vox and Vax.
Yeah, I'm a lot less well versed in the first campaign. I'll get to it, but
yeah, I only know a little bit, and still there I know about that stuff. But leaving the Mercer effect behind, there is so much to learn. At the same time, there is something that's really good about building a world first. And the Forgotten Realms is there for that, and so is Eberron and these other worlds. But the difficulty curve involved in building your own world can be kind of a deterrent.
Absolutely. Things can be, or I suppose maybe not a deterrent wouldn't be the word I would use, more of a stumbling block. Mm-hmm. I've seen some, so I try to get my brother into running a D&D game, right? And he loves D&D. He loves it, and he wanted to, and it was pretty quickly, he ran a module, and then he was very excited to make his own world, but it wasn't great, put simply. It was very generic, and it was kind of become a running joke that, like, I would suggest, like, oh no, now we need to go do this thing, and then suddenly him behind the DMs can go, just like start clamming up, because I had exactly predicted how the plot was about to go.
Oh, that's great. And I mean, sometimes that's a great thing, but yes, that is definitely one of the big issues, is the amount of work involved in keeping a homebrew world feeling fresh.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, as that's sometimes the call to action, is that work, is that creative muscles that you get to use. And a lot of the time, DMs are oftentimes people who either want to make games, like video games, and other people who want to write books. I know personally, I love to study history and all that kind of stuff, so I love influencing my world with folklore and history.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't wait till I get to throw that in there, and I really want to see how my players react. Yeah. I already know how they react, and it's been great.
It definitely, absolutely, it can be it can be very hard and very, like, intimidating, and also very hard to pull off, but it is certainly, world building is one of the most satisfying things as a DM.
Absolutely. And calling back to putting in the knowledge you have. A lot of the times we're told, write what we know. Mm-hmm. And in that aspect, a lot of the times we do write what we know. Many DMs will put their own biases in there. For instance, in my case, I oftentimes include clauses to certain characters like, hey, I really want half-orcs to be considered a dangerous race, and people are afraid of you, because I want my orcs to be savage. Well, at the same time, I ask the elves, do you want me to make your guys' characters hated by humans? Do you guys want me to make you guys mysterious?
Yeah, exactly. It's important, yeah. With that, it's important just to make sure that the players, even if stuff has already been preset, like if you were going to say, like, half-orcs are dangerous and they're not going to be accepted in society. Mm-hmm. That is something that actually, well, it's very important that even if you are very set on that, you need to be able to communicate that.
Absolutely. And I have had that problem before where my players walked into a grim, dark world and they were not prepared for it.
Very much so, yeah.
And that was their first campaign too. I told them, hey, these are the stereotypes for these races, and this is what you have to choose from. Well, I've learned from multiple experiences that new players need to be given that freedom. Especially if you are an experienced DM and you are doing this for the players, let them make their choices. It definitely helps, like, by a metric ton.
Absolutely. And the best part is, like some of the many examples we brought up before, it feels unique. It feels awesome. If you are the Shardmind, that is something that no one else can lay claim to. That is awesome.
Absolutely. And also the personality between each DM's campaigns. We've recently been talking about this between one another, and like even the setup of this podcast. We were talking about the personality of our games. I've oftentimes been described as a funhouse DM, or I like to describe my thing as like cinematic. And then it was brought up that my games oftentimes play out like an anime, where it's like epic fight scenes and like this is about to happen, and then we get ready for it, and like the build up, all that kind of stuff. And I skip over the details and stuff, while my co-host here is all about those details.
Oh, yes. I feel like that one of the main things that I love is just making it so that, because things are so grounded. So there's so many little details, so many little hooks that the players can feel like, oh crap, this is real. We can actually go back. Like a very simple example is the calendar. I keep track of exactly what happens on every single day and going back. And I don't expect the players to ever look at the calendar, really.
I do.
Oh, sweet, excellent. But the point is, I don't expect it. I don't expect people to dig into all the little rules. I think that just having it exist gives them the reason to take it seriously.
Absolutely, and that is definitely something that I love about your campaigns, but I could never do myself. And oftentimes when I try to do that, my players are like, "Excuse me, what? No. I thought I was going to be able to make fantasy nukes. I thought I was going to be able to. I thought I was going to be able to play this weird guy that just has this gimmick. I thought I was going to be able to play Obak the Dream Crusher, or I thought I was going to be able to play a lich, or a dog who can cast spells.
Oh, that was weird. And
I have had players ask me for some pretty weird things. I wanted to play a pig with a wand. That is something that has been asked of me.
And different DMs you can make it work. Like that dog example. I remember it worked. It wasn't great, but it worked out.
I learned from experience. She also asked if she could play a unicorn, not like the unicorn and then some sort of class or anything like that, where a player who a druid who I just gave her the unicorn stat block occasionally. No, she wanted to play a unicorn and she lost her mind when I took away the unicorn.
Yeah.
So I've learned from experience that a lot of players, when they come to my games, they're like, let's mess crap up. We are going to do whatever we want, and he's going to let us. And I expect that of my players now. While in your campaigns, from the very beginning, your campaigns have been so grounded, and we've respected the amount of work that you put in, that it has been almost like a state of being to play your games, and the fact that we are grounded, the world feels real, and we think back on the world like, hey, what are the consequences?
Exactly. So there's just the cultivating the different things can bring a lot of stuff just to the player's state of mind every session.
Absolutely, and the freedom of the DM to cultivate that personality. And lastly, before we close up this podcast, we got to talk about the meta of homebrew, and the fact that people treat the homebrew campaign with that personality beforehand, just like I mentioned. When someone comes to one of my games, they expect it to be insane. They expect it to be wacky. They don't come to me with super weak characters unless I ask them to. And when they come to me with min-maxed characters, with characters who can literally cast a spell for 4 hours that clears the dungeon, Moonbeam. Or who can get trapped in a room and then just fly to the top, I fully am prepared for that. That is what I'm ready to do. And also, they know that their choices are all that matters. While when someone comes to you, they expect that your game is going to be grounded, and at least in my case, I expect that I'm going to have to come to you with my homebrew before I try it.
Yes, yeah. I have some standards in that, but I feel that there's kind of going to be some there's some goods and bads, actually for both of our styles. I feel that if you were trying to pull off my style, I feel it'd be really hard. Because
I've tried, and it is terrible. It is hard. I don't like it.
Yeah, but
I love to try and doing it, but I cannot.
But specifically what I'm talking about is that people are going to come in expecting zany insanity.
The expectation is a curse.
Exactly. Whereas if someone's going to come to mine and I was going to try to doing something very weird off the wall, and I don't have a good logical explanation for it,
it gets uncomfortable. We go, no, that doesn't make sense. And you go, why does it have to make sense? It doesn't make sense in Max's campaigns. And it just, you're right. It does change the aspect. And the players pick up on that pretty fast.
Oh, yeah.
And it definitely changes how they feel. And oftentimes it can ruin a game just by the expectation beforehand.
Yeah.
And speaking to that, during the game, when players expected one thing and get another thing, someone could come to the game with this really well thought out character, a great backstory and everything like that. And then they come to my game, and I read that backstory and I definitely did stuff with it, but then I kill their character because I like worlds with real consequences. You wanted your elf barbarian who has defeated a dragon lord before. Fine. You want to fight another one?
Oh dear.
Like, I love games with consequences, but at the same time, as my players have pointed out to me, that they don't always love consequences, and how players act during games is definitely something pretty that changes based on the personality of the game and the personality of the DM.
Yeah. One thing, I personally, this might just be a thing, I like the idea of being the note taker, right? Like, when I started off the game that, are both our friends running, I was taking prolific notes. I had exactly written down on all these different kinds of things, but the thing is, none of it ever came back. Like, frequently we would just leave it to a different setting, and I could just throw away the paper. There was no point in it. And it's kind of, it's unfortunate. Different people bring different styles, and eventually people will, hone in. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, people will figure out how the other person's style goes, but yeah.
Absolutely. In one of my games, one of our players who is now transitioned over into your game has he always played a character who was very active, and he loved to be part of the story, and he moved the story forward. While in your game, up until just recently, he has not moved the story. He was a player in the story, but the story was constantly being moved by either you or me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just how that player worked. And it was because he felt uncomfortable in a world that was so fleshed out, and now that he's actually gained his bearings, he is pushing the game forward on his own terms.
Absolutely. I'm excited for that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not. I'm mad about it. This was going to be my action. No, there is definitely something great about that, and being a more veteran myself compared to him, I definitely like seeing this, and it definitely is interesting watching him go from I was comfortable, I was uncomfortable, I was comfortable again.
Exactly, yeah.
And lastly, we just want to bring up the social stigmas of homebrewing, and the fact that players go, will either go, oh no, not another homebrew, and oh no, what do I have to learn now? What rules are changing? Or they go, oh yay, a homebrew, I get to do whatever I want. Or they go, oh cool, there's this new rule. How does it work? How do I interact with it?
Oh yeah. I think that there's definitely this definitely does play back into the previous one a lot with just talking about how your DM is running things and kind of like the confidence they have in it. Because I think that there's a lot of times there's the, if you're starting out and your DM, you don't trust them, not trust them is not exactly the right word, but if you don't, if you're not ready to believe in the craziness of their world, it's going to be very awkward. You're going to be working around and you're trying to say, okay, I think this is going to how stuff's going to work, but
yeah, and in writing we oftentimes refer to that as a suspension of disbelief, where you accept that you accept the rules of this world rather than being the rules of my world and of my perspective. And sometimes you do have a world where certain social faux pas is acceptable in that world, and you can't get behind that. As well as you have worlds where nothing is acceptable, and your characters or everything is super realistic, and it can really change how your players really interact with said world as well as what they're going into.
It would be really hilarious if suddenly the standards of in D&D, it's very common to kill things all the time, but at the same time, if you try to play realistic standards of oh crap, we found a body, there's gonna be a huge investigation going on.
Absolutely, and I've done that before. I've attempted urban fantasy games, and they are so funny. And there was one done by College Humor, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's they have a game called The Sleepless City, and essentially it is it's D&D taking place in like modern New York, and it's great. Except for I haven't actually seen too much of it, so I can't really speak to the fact whether or not they take care of, oh, you killed some monsters, but also a goblin's a playable race now in D&D.
Yeah, I feel like those have been like a huge source of like conflict.
Yeah, that's been a conflict in our current game too, as we have we have two characters in that game who are like goblins are killable, expendable monsters, and then we have two characters in that game also who are like, one of our friends was a goblin, which is kind of funny because that character used to be my character before he died.
Oh, yep. There's a whole lot of weird stuff, and I think that like if you can explore it, if you can like set up a situation where people are okay with seeing the weirdness, then I think it can work. Though I think there's also some times when it just kind of becomes if it's suddenly a huge surprise, just like a slap in the face, like, wait a minute. We're not supposed to kill the bandits who are attacking us?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, like, in an urban fantasy game, you don't have bandits attacking you. Maybe the mafia comes over and breaks your kneecaps, but the thing is, you fight them, and now you're going to either go to jail, like, now you're going to either be, like, investigated, and now you have to deal with that, and does your DM make you think about paperwork? Because that can really bog down a game and make you think, oh, wait, what the crap, like, what is going on? And then it doesn't actually, like, take place, and then you're like, well, what were the consequences? Like, how much consequences do you instill? And a lot of that comes down to how, like you said, how realistic is this world? How believable is this world? And it definitely is something interesting when you consider that a lot of the monstrous races are playable. They are races for players to choose from. Let alone the fact that they are, like, monsters. And if someone plays Lost Minds of Phandelver and someone's playing a goblin, a kobold, and a bugbear, I'd love to see that take place.
That would be hilarious.
But what are they supposed to do?
Yeah.
I mean, the goblin and the bugbear, as far as Forgotten Realms goes, that makes sense. Like, bugbears and goblins don't like other bugbears and goblins.
Yeah, that's fair. You can make that work. Yeah.
And, like, are there some creatures that are more intelligent? And so, besides going further in on this tangent, you have a lot of these things where you have these, like, stigmas against, like, homebrewing because you're like, what are the rules of the world?
Yeah, it definitely does. With that, it's complicated. I don't know.
It's complicated, and I think that's the best way to finish explaining it, because the expectations and the idea behind all that is definitely something that you have to deal with when playing a game, because it really is, hey, this is my world, this is my baby that I'm letting you guys play on. Like, this world I made by my own hands, and now the players are like, oh no, like, do we, like, how much can we actually do in this world? Or they're like some of our players who are just like, haha, I'm going to do whatever I want.
Exactly, yeah. There's going to be that. There's a whole like dealing with the whole dynamic there is very complicated, but I think, yeah. I don't know, I think in general, like with a lot of things, it's just kind of down to communication.
Absolutely. So I think with that, mentioning that last little thing, communication, is probably the best way we can end today. And thank you for listening. We want to do this where it's really just me and a friend, and it's just us getting together, talking about some role-playing games and the narrative and mechanics behind them.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this is very much a
experiment.
Yeah, we're figuring things out.
Yeah. We're going to be releasing this as our pilot episode, and there'll be a lot to it. So thank you for listening. Signing off, my name's Max.
And I'm Ethan.
And we are LNG. We are the LNGcast.
Yep. See you next time.